I know there's a movement for, grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and that certainly is better than feedlot beef. But I talked about in the plant paradox about a interesting sugar molecule that is called Nu5GC, capital G, and it's present in beef, lamb, pork, and also milk. And we have a different sugar molecule in us that's called Nu5AC, capital A. Now, those two molecules differ by only one molecule of oxygen. They're otherwise identical. And in the plant paradox, I talked about the fact that we know that when we eat Nu5GC containing foods, beef, lamb, pork, or milk, that we make antibodies to Nu5GC, this sugar molecule, because it is foreign. And that's interesting in itself. We've known for a very long time that there's a strong association between red meat eating and milk and heart disease, arthritis, dementia, and cancer. Very strong associations. Now, association does not mean causation. I'm the first to agree with that. So for a number of years, we were trying to figure out, okay, why is there such a strong association? And one of the theories is that because Nu5AC and Nu5GC look so similar, and we make antibodies to Nu5GC, we maybe by mistake attack our sugar molecule, Nu5AC. It's called molecular mimicry. Now, why is that important? Well, Nu5AC, as I talk about in Gut Check, lines the protective layer on our blood vessels. It lines the protective layer in our blood-brain barrier, a virtual impenetrable barrier. It lines our joints. And it's called the glycocalyx for anyone who cares. And there won't be a test, I promise. So now we know that the more Nu5GC containing foods we eat, the more it's incorporated into the lining, the glycocalyx of our blood vessels, the glycocalyx of our brain, the glycocalyx of our joints. And it's kind of swapped off. So, and you can show in experimental animals that the more Nu5GC you eat, the more it ends up in these places and displaces Nu5AC. Now, Nu5AC is in chicken and fish and shellfish in us. And you can show that the more Nu5AC containing foods you eat, and the less Nu5GC containing foods you eat, the more Nu5GC is displaced from these very important structures with Nu5AC. So now there's no longer a question, at least in my mind and many others, that this is a causation that actually is a reason why. So we literally attack our lining of our blood vessels, our brain lining, our joint lining, because of this abnormal sugar molecule that we make antibodies to. Even worse, animals who have Nu5GC won't let Nu5GC in their brain because it's an incredibly neuroinflammatory compound. And it won't exist inside their brains. And yet, if we eat Nu5GC, it breaks down the blood-brain barrier and gets into our brains, where it's one of the best causes of neuroinflammation anyone's ever discovered, which explains the high association with red meat eating and dementia. Man.
One of my favorite Quicksilver Scientific products is their liposomal vitamin C. It's great for immune support, collagen production, and antioxidant protection. The liposome is a great delivery system for effectively getting the vitamin C into your body. Save 15% by clicking the link in the description. And now back to the show. All right, I got to break this down. There's a lot here. So Nu5GC is in things like red meat, milk from dairy cows.
From goats, from sheep.
Goats and sheep too?
Yep.
Okay. So when we eat these foods, that becomes incorporated in our tissues, and we make antibodies against it at the same time?
Correct.
Okay, so those antibodies are obviously going to attack that tissue of our body that's been incorporated with the new 5GC.
Yep.
And it can also cross the blood-brain barrier and cause problems up in the brain and the head as well. Okay, so given all this, we're taking all these foods right off the table according to your new book and your new diet. Red meat.
No.
Okay, wait, there is a caveat there. What I read in the book, we can ferment to get rid of them. Okay, let's get into that. So for somebody right now where their head is spinning saying, these foods we're talking about are a big part of my diet, let's talk about fermenting and if there's any other ways we can, quote unquote, treat these foods to make them palatable.
Yeah, what's fascinating is last year there was a paper out of Norway that looked at people with what's called stable angina. Stable angina means you have blockages in your coronary arteries that are there. And when you walk fast or exercise fast, you get chest pain, you get angina. And if you stop, your angina goes away and it's stable. It doesn't really change. So they looked at a large number of human beings with stable angina, and they followed their consumption of butter, milk, and cheese. And they showed that the more butter a person ate, then the more their stable angina would become unstable angina, basically become a heart attack. Same with milk. The more milk a person drank, the same thing happened. Now, with cheese, on the other hand, the more cheese a person ate, the better their stable angina got. In other words, it improved. Now, the headline that made all the news was dairy is really bad for the heart. Well, butter and milk was bad for the heart, but cheese was exactly the opposite. And that unfortunately didn't make the news because that's not really cool. So what happened with the cheese? Well, the cheese, it turns out that bacteria love sugar. That's what they like to eat. And bacteria ferment sugar. When we yeast ferments sugar. When we make wine, the yeast are fermenting the sugar in the grapes, and so on and so forth. In cheese, the bacteria in a traditional cheese culture eat the new 5GC that was present in the milk. And there isn't any new 5GC. For instance, there's no new 5GC in Parmesan cheese, just as an example. There's no new 5GC in Pecorino, sheep cheese. But there's oodles of it in the cow's milk that went into Parmesan cheese, and there's oodles of it in the sheep milk that went into the Pecorino. But the bacteria ate it. And as I talk about in the book, these bacteria make all these really cool compounds that really promote longevity called polyamines. And one of my favorite ones is spermidine, and you can guess where that name came from. So fast forward, the longest living people in the world by country is the longest lifespan of any country is a little tiny country between France and Spain called Andorra. And Andorra is way up in the Pyrenees Mountains, about 150,000 people. They're primarily sheep and goat herders, and their diet consists of a lot of goat and sheep cheese, but they eat tons of sausages every day. In fact, Toulouse, which is very nearby in the French border, Toulouse is famous for their sausages and foie gras, and Toulouse, despite that diet, has the lowest incidence of coronary artery disease in France. How'd they get away with that? Well, it turns out that traditional sausage making is also done by inoculating the sausages with bacteria, and the bacteria eat the new 5-GC. And traditionally, there was no storage system for food except by fermentation or smoking, and you always used all parts of the animal. So just so happens that bacteria did the job of taking the harm out of new 5-GC containing products. And that explains why these long-lived people are actually not being harmed by these foods, but are actually getting a benefit out of these foods. Who knew?
Okay, so these people over in Europe are fermenting their sausages and cheese to remove the new 5-GC.
They didn't know that's what they were doing.
No, but now we can look back and figure that out.
Now we can say, hey, how come these guys get away with this?
My question then is, come to North America, the way we process sausage and cheese, is it still doing the same thing there?
No. So, a Kraft single slice is not cheese by any means. And we've discovered ways bypassing this process. When I was growing up, literally up until Wonder Bread, all bread was fermented. That's how you raised a loaf, but it doesn't make for a uniform, beautiful whole. So bread makers figured out how to do the process without using any fermentation, using glutaminases to do the job and raise things without any process of bacterial fermentation. It's the same thing. Bread may look like bread, but it has nothing to do with the original feature. The other thing that we know is that bacteria really enjoy eating lectins. There are lectin-eating bacteria. They love eating all sorts of things. When we fermented our bread years ago, they were really good at eating the lectins and a lot of the sugars in these grains, but nobody does that anymore. So things look like what they used to look like. They certainly don't taste like what they used to look like, but they bear no relationship to what sustained us 100 years ago.
Okay, so to get practical, somebody's going to Whole Foods, buying organic pork sausages. Have any of those been fermented this way? Like, is there anything we can go to the store and buy meat-wise, or sausage-wise, that is done this way?
So if you actually get a sausage from Italy or France or Portugal, where, it's all white on the outside and gnarly, and it doesn't just have an Italian name. I see so many of my patients fooled by, I bought, so-and-so Italian name sausage. And I go, well, where was it made? They go, well, let me look. San Francisco. I said, no, sorry. There are people, a good friend of mine, I'll drop his name, Jimmy Schmidt, who's won 3 James Beard Awards. Great chef and a good friend of mine. He ferments his hot dogs and bratwursts and removes new 5-GC. Whoa.
Okay. So when it comes to new 5-GC, foods that we don't have to worry about, chicken, fish, seafood, any other animal product, including dairy from goat and sheep, contains it.
Right. So we
need the fermentation in there to remove it before it's safe for us to eat.
Right. So for instance, a goat or sheep yogurt, new 5-GC will be gone. A goat or sheep kefir, it'll be gone. Traditionally fermented cheeses, it'll be gone, which is the exciting thing. And so, here's a pretty lethal molecule that traditional cultures have deactivated through the process of preserving something that was not being able to be refrigerated, like milk and meats. And it just so happens that the bacteria and us, we're supposed to get along very well. And in a way, the book is about, look, bacteria and everybody else who lives in your gut really has your back if you'd stop starving them and killing them off. How we started this interview is we've done a spectacular job of stabbing them not only in the back, but smashing their face in as well.
So when it comes to red meat, steaks and things like that, they're a no-go even over in Europe. They're not processing those in a way. For somebody who's like, I'm not giving up my steak, is there any hope for them?
So, I have no dog in this fight. People say, oh, you're a radical vegan. Well, I'm certainly not a vegan. I grew up in Omaha. I grew up in Milwaukee. Bratwurst, was, one of the finest foods invented by mankind. Anyhow, the problem is that we've lost sight of how harmful this stuff is, number one. Number two, all the grass-fed, grass-finished beef in the world is not going to get rid of new 5GC. It may be that wet or dry aging of these beef was the traditional way of eating the new 5GC. I haven't found anybody who's done a study on it, but I'm very suspicious that in the process of dry or wet aging, where you see all this fungus and bacterial cultures on these cuts of meat, that's was another way of reducing new 5GC. By the way, the highest content of new 5GC is in liver. And so I just love all these guys who said, oh, you got to have all your organ meats. They're so good for you. Not.
Or even beef bone broth you talk about in the book.
Yeah, or even beef bone broth. Sorry. It's full of new 5GC.
But when you look back at history, wouldn't we have to assume a lot of red meat was eaten throughout our evolution?
Well, we actually... don't get me started. It's another book that's on the way. We actually were shellfish and fish eaters wading in streams and in the Indian Ocean. And that's actually where our big brains came from. And that's actually where the hair pattern on us came from. And long story short, and guess what? Your foot is not good for running. It's actually a flipper. Take a look sometime.
Can't wait for the new book. We're talking about the new book, but the next new book.
So that's a problem. And again, there is, sorry about it, folks. There's very, very, very strong associations between red meat eating and cancer, for instance. Now that gets really interesting because it turns out that cancer cells, tumors, utilize new 5GC to produce localized inflammation that actually the white blood cells produce the environment of an oxygen-low environment that allows cancer cells to thrive and prevents normal cells from thriving. And why do they do that? Because new 5G is inflammatory. And so that was a piece of the puzzle. We knew that new 5GC was in tumors. Every tumor you ever remove is full of new 5GC. And yet we do not manufacture new 5GC. We have no mechanism to do it. We don't have the gene. We don't have the enzyme. So new 5GC in cancer cells had to be acquired from the diet. And it's only present in beef, lamb, pork, and milk.
Earlier, when you mentioned the new 5GC in the animals that we're getting it from, not making it into the brain, do we have any idea why our anatomy and physiology is different and it can pass through?
Yeah, because new 5GC in us, when we eat it, is incorporated into this protective wall, the blood-brain barrier of the brain. And we then attack that blood-brain barrier because it now has a foreign substance. And new 5GC then gets through the blood-brain barrier. Sadly, as I write about in the book, if you have leaky gut, I will guarantee you have leaky brain. And if you don't want brain fog, if you don't want depression, if you don't want dementia or Parkinson's, then you don't want leaky gut because you don't want leaky brain.
As you talk about that mechanism, I hear where you're coming from there. The fact that as we're eating these animals, it becomes incorporated into the blood-brain barrier. Antibodies attack it, make that now porous for things to go through.
Porous.
Where my head goes now is thinking about leaky gut in general, the gut itself. So as we're eating new 5GC, is that being incorporated into the gut wall and then the antibodies perforating that as well?
That's why the idea that bone broth is healing to your gut is just one of the greatest internet myths that I encountered.
Were you at one point a believer in it?
No. You'll notice that Gundry MD never and never will sell a broth product, an animal-based collagen product. The science is so good that I wouldn't put my name on it. Remember, my name is on my products, and I'm not there to follow some crazy hype.
Coming back to the antibody piece, I'm picturing the cow who we're getting the new 5GC from. Do animals ever make antibodies, autoantibodies themselves?
No.
That keeps their gut intact then and their blood-brain barrier intact. Okay.
Yeah, they don't. Again, we realize that we're not making autoantibodies to new 5AC. That was the theory. Now we know that, we don't have to have that theory. We now know the new 5GC, which is foreign, we make antibodies to it, and that new 5GC is incorporated into these protective structures in our gut wall, in our blood vessels, in our joints, in our brain. And so our natural antibodies that we make to new 5GC then attack these things. And as I lay out in Gut Check, with a lot of references, that there is this correlation between beef, lamb, pork, and milk eating and all of these diseases and cancer. Strong. And now we have the mechanism. I'm glad we have the mechanism because now we can put an end to this, that's just conjecture. Association does not mean causation. We now have the mechanism of causation.
All right, well, we can't leave this topic without getting into carnivore. And the two of us have discussed it before, but now that we have all this new information brought into the picture, how do you feel about this group of people online, obviously in person as well, but we see them online, who have been on this diet for a period of time, presumably healing from different conditions, including autoimmune, and you're somebody who's still in clinical practice 6 days a week. I'm sure you see a lot of these people coming to see you, and you've probably seen success stories. Given what we just said, how is that happening?
Well, I have success stories in my own practice. I'll put people on an elimination diet, and part of it, of course, is, for the most part, getting glyphosate out of their diet, getting lectin-containing foods out of their diet. And, the original, for instance, Atkins diet was basically an elimination diet. It got lectins out of people, and it was actually very effective. So, and we see this work. I have a patient who's also a dear personal friend who was a vegan. And one of my typical not very healthy vegans. And eventually, we got to the point of putting him on a carnivore diet, if you want to call it that, and he dramatically improved. Went from having like 5 or 6 loose bowel movements a day to normal form stools, and he's happy as a clam. Now, like all of my patients who do this, many of them have remarkable success. But when we look at their blood work, we see a progressive increase in, we have a measurement of stickiness of blood vessels that's called PLA2, that really looks at whether your blood vessels are lined with fly paper or not. I'm old enough to remember fly paper. And it goes up. And we look at other inflammatory markers, and it goes up. And we look at oxidized LDL, which, if you like the cholesterol theory of heart disease, which I'm not wild about, if you like the cholesterol theory of heart disease, then cholesterol has to be oxidized. And these people in general, their oxidized cholesterol goes up. So, yeah, you're almost certainly making their symptoms better. But I think this is a short-term fix. For instance, right now, with him, just based on his new blood work, we're going to start weaning him off some of these foods. In him, we try to use mostly wild fish and shellfish as part of his diet. He and his partner live over in Portugal now, so they have much better access to, for instance, he really only eats fermented sausages as part of his diet, just to give you an example.
I'm just picturing the carnivore here in North America, though, consuming steaks left, right, and center, ground beef, accumulating all this new 5GC that we're talking about into their body, building up the antibodies, attacking their gut, their blood-brain barrier. If that's happening, how can the two happen at the same time? The healing plus this cascade, like we're talking about, of incorporation and attacking the body.
Well, remember, you don't clog your blood vessels overnight. You don't destroy your joints overnight. You don't destroy your brain overnight. This is a long-term process. Luckily, we can measure these things happening. We can measure neuroinflammation. We can measure breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. We can certainly measure leaky gut, and we can measure it getting better or getting worse. So most of the blood tests that docs use in their regular practice never even look at this. I mean, I train third-year family practice residents in my clinic. They rotate through on a monthly basis. And these are doctors who are about to enter practice. This is their third year. And to a person, they have never heard of measuring a fasting insulin level. They've never heard of how to measure insulin resistance. And it's like, first time it happening. What do you mean? This is, I always say, if you have one blood test, you only get one blood test, that's it. That's all anybody's going to pay for, or it's a fasting insulin level. If I only had one to predict somebody's fate. And yet they're not even taught this in 2023, going on 2024. So that's how these things are missed. And what I've been spending my 25 years now doing this is trying to figure out how Hippocrates knew all this. And gut check is my way of saying, here's what the guy knew. And here's why he said all disease begins in the gut. And the good news is all disease can be cured in the gut. So that's the exciting part of all this.
We're going to get deep into the gut in a bit here, but I want to continue on this train of thought here. And I'm picturing somebody right now who, say, comes to see you or otherwise. They've been having non-fermented dairy, all kinds of red meat, pork. There are a new 5
GC nightmare.
It's a nightmare word. New 5GC nightmare bomb.
Yeah.
What hope do they have to clear that up? It's been incorporated in their system. They've got the autoantibodies. How does it clean itself up?
That's the great thing, and like I talk about in the book, the less you eat of new 5GC containing foods, beef, lamb, pork, milk, and the more you eat of wild fish, wild shellfish, properly raised chickens, the more these sugar molecules are displaced from where they're hanging out with new 5AC. And that's the exciting thing. You can actually say, okay, I want a grass-fed, grass-finished filet once a week or once a month. What do you say? And I say, hey, that'll be great. Let's not have it twice a day like the average American does. Let's have time to knock those guys out. Or go, when we're over in Italy, we have all these amazing salamis and charcuterie for breakfast, late breakfast, every day. And we're just amazed that when I go around studying these long people, they have these sausages, and it's go, wait a minute, you don't have any coronary disease, you're not dying of cancer, and you're eating this really bad stuff for you. And then you start going, well, maybe this bad stuff isn't bad, and why isn't it bad? So that's why these people, like one of my books, there's a farmer in Campagnella, who used to be one of the longest living people in Italy. They all left as the tourists. But he said, for a year, I feed my pig, and then for a year, the pig feeds me and my family. And it's actually a pretty cool description. So they didn't eat the pig. They didn't freeze the pig. They ground up the pig and made it into sausage.
So given what you know about this new 5GC, are you periodically still having things like steak and lamb and pork?
Yeah. So
given that we can remove it from the body by having the quote unquote good foods.
Yeah, I'll do it maybe once a month. I don't have lamb anymore. Lamb, unfortunately, is the highest form of highest containing new 5GC. But we have a local farmer with grass-fed, grass-finished beef that supplies a restaurant around here, and we'll have it every now and then. But it's now a treat. If you think ice cream is a dangerous treat, then we should view that grass-fed, grass-finished beef as a dangerous treat.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
Most probiotic-containing foods have no living bacteria. Most yogurts, they're all dead. Kimchi, they're all dead. That's a bunch of hooey. Well, it turns out that these dead bacteria have made